What needs to happen before Bitcoin can have its next parabolic bull market? Let's discuss. Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin and what do we need to see before we might expect Bitcoin to be able to go on another impressive parabolic bull run like we've seen in the past. So to talk first about more short-term price action for Bitcoin, obviously it's been quite disappointing. I had made a video back while we were pumping off of the news that Grayscale won their case against the SEC. And at the time I said that if the broader macro backdrop allowed, this maybe could have been the start of another move up. Of course, that's not what we saw. And the reasons are pretty apparent just looking at the data. If we look at the DXY, so the strength of the dollar relative to a basket of other fiat currencies, see the dollar has been rallying strongly in the last few days, breaking above its May 23 high back over here, and also then going up to try to target its March 23 highs back over here. And the reason that this is important is that crypto tends to be inversely correlated to the DXY. When it's going up, crypto tends to do well. And so in that video, I said that if we saw the dollar break to the upside, that would be an invalidation of us rallying. And also if we saw the stock market start to roll over and fall, that would also be an invalidation. Both of those things have happened, and so for those reasons, it's not entirely surprising that Bitcoin failed in this rally and pushed back down. We're just not in a risk-on environment right now. When we think about what do we need to clear for Bitcoin to go on to that next bull market, a lot of these short-term considerations are relatively just noise. You know, if we go back and look at price action before prior parabolic bull markets, there's huge amounts of volatility that happen in these ranges. But really, when we go back and look at them in hindsight, it's all just one big homogeneous accumulation zone before the big run. Same thing even through here. And so if Bitcoin can go on another bull market, and if it doesn't go on to set new lows, the same thing might happen here. And so worrying too much about these short-term price action, even though that's something that is oftentimes what everyone wants to talk about because it's the thing is right in front of our faces that we're encountering every single day, it's not necessarily the most important for when we're thinking about that broader movement, which is really what matters. Who cares if you get into Bitcoin up at 30K or 25K if it's going to do something like this later on? You're just more important to catch this move than worry too much about that exact entry price. So what is that big thing that stands in the way of thinking that Bitcoin is just on its merry way to the next big bull run? Well, really, in my opinion, it's the likelihood of a recession. Probably not too big of a surprise. And currently, we're in a situation where there's some conflicting views on this. So there are a lot of news articles and things coming out with analysts and other groups cutting their chances of recession. So there's some sign of the mainstream moving against the idea of a recession being imminent. But that's not the universal view. And certainly if you go on to Twitter, now called X, of course, you'll see tons and tons of people beating the recession drum, saying that a recession is coming either at the end of the year or sometime in the first quarter or first half of next year. And so that, in my opinion, really stands as being the key factor for Bitcoin. That if we don't get a recession, in my opinion, the chances of us just going on another Bitcoin bull market are quite reasonable, are quite good. I wouldn't see any reason why we couldn't see another bull market start to form. But if a recession happens, it starts to make us ask some questions. So why do I think that's the case? Why am I holding that view? Well, I want to talk about one set of data that I think helps give a picture about why this might be a reasonable view to hold. And so I want to talk about some on-chain data today. So first here, I just want to show some data from Chain Exposed that's looking at the selling that's happened over the last 30 days and where that selling has been happening. Basically, coins bought at different times and therefore prices, which ones have been sold in the last 30 days. And so with things getting decidedly more bearish in the last month, it's useful to decide who has been deciding to exit the market at this time and who hasn't. And what you'll notice is that across the board, it's people who haven't held Bitcoin for super long. The furthest back we can go here is December of 2021. Which certainly now is well over a year, you know, getting closer to 2 years, but it's not the really OG holders, the people who've been in Bitcoin for years and years and years at this point. And not a whole lot has been sold from those levels. And even people who bought back down here in the lows of 2022 and then going into early 2023, down in the lows before this big run, not a whole lot of people have been selling from there either. Not that many people have been selling from those levels. Most of it, the vast majority, has been people who bought the top over here, which tends to be the case, short-term holders. But this is important because as much panic has been coming into the market, as fearful as people have been on Twitter, we haven't seen those really long-term holders blink yet. They haven't been selling. And only some people, only a few people who bought the lows here, who would have aged in the long-term holder cohort, have actually been taking the time to sell within this last month. Now you might ask, why is that happening with all this fear? Why aren't some old people who have been holding longer starting to panic here? Well, remember that a lot of Bitcoin changed hands during this period. There was a lot of changing of holders during this time. And really what was likely happening was during this time, a lot of the people who bought at the highs of the bull market back here capitulated and got out. And then they are no longer possible sell pressure as we're moving back up here. They already sold. They don't hold their Bitcoin. And we can also see this if we look at some other data. So here I want to show you the Bitcoin days destroyed in loss chart, which is also here at Chain Exposed. And Bitcoin days are basically, if you hold a Bitcoin for a day, you've accrued 1 Bitcoin day, and every day you continue to hold that Bitcoin, that's 1 more Bitcoin day that's being linked to that Bitcoin you hold. And then when you sell that Bitcoin, all of those days that you've accumulated get destroyed. So if you've been holding Bitcoin for a year, and then you sell it, in this case, if you sell it at a loss, then all of the days that you've been holding it would be added to this total. And so the idea is that when you see big spikes in this, you're either seeing a ton of people spend Bitcoin at a loss, or more likely, a lot of people spending Bitcoin at a loss who've been holding that Bitcoin for a long time. And you see this spiking up down at the lows of bear markets. And one of the reasons why that's likely happening is that a lot of people who bought the top at the previous bull market are capitulating at those points, and all of those Bitcoin days they accumulated waiting that long get added to this total as they sell in loss. And so you can see that happening here, that in June, July of 2022, and then again over here going into December, November, December, and then early January of 2023, you see these big spikes. And again, that's where people are selling at a loss who've been holding it for a while, likely these folks up through here. And so what that means is that a lot of the people who are going to sell because of Bitcoin going to a bear market have already done it. So they're not likely to be adding to sell pressure here. And the people who are holding Bitcoin, a lot of them are the ones who stepped in to buy up that supply down here at the relative lows. And so though some of them have decided to sell in the last month, not all that many. A lot of them are waiting probably for higher prices. And so if we also just look then at the distribution of Bitcoin realized price across the entire price spectrum. So basically, realized price for Bitcoin is if I spend a Bitcoin, then I am realizing the price of that Bitcoin at whatever price I spent it on, and then someone's buying it from me, and that becomes their cost basis. So my realized price, the price at which I spend my Bitcoin, becomes the cost basis of whoever bought it. And so this is essentially a distribution of cost basis for Bitcoin across the different price levels. And what you'll see is that where we're trading right now, right around 25, 26K, we're right in the middle of two big upticks. So I've excluded all shorter term holders. I'm only leaving on long-term holders in this chart. And we can see is that there's some resistance ahead. There's some cost basis that exists for long-term holders above us, but a lot of it that exists below us. And so we're thinking of what will get these people to sell. If they haven't decided to sell yet already, so either people who bought the local lows through here and not taking profit on that trade, they're waiting for longer, or the people who bought a lot earlier. When you think, what would actually make them change their mind and think that this is now a price they'd like to sell their Bitcoin at, even though they've given up the opportunity to do so back when Bitcoin was up at 30K. And then for these folks who've been holding it all the way down, from 10K and lower, why didn't they spend it up at 60K? Why are they still holding on to it? What would make them change their mind? And so that's again where a recession is probably the thing that would matter, that we'd really care about, because that might be a thing that could push people's evaluations to have them change their mind of where they think is a reasonable place to sell. That if suddenly the environment changed, the world changes, and suddenly now it's a lot more plausible that Bitcoin could fall way lower potentially, that might be a thing that would shake out, for example, some of these folks who've been holding ever since the bull market highs of 2021. Maybe they decide time to get out. Or maybe some of these folks who've been holding for a really long time decide, you know what, I'll cash in some profit here, wait for it to go lower, then maybe rebuy or something like that. Now with these folks up here, I think these are ones who are interesting to think about because they have been enduring a lot of pain already. If you've been holding Bitcoin from 57K, from over 60K, you're already way down on your investment. And so the question would be, if Bitcoin continues to fall, or if a recession comes and you think Bitcoin is going to fall further, is that still going to be enough to kick these people off of their position who have already endured all this pain? I think it's an interesting question to consider. And I think an interesting framework to think about this question through is that of prospect theory. So if you're not familiar, this is a psychological theory that talks about the experience of pain or happiness at different levels of loss and gain. And so the thing you've probably heard about prospect theory is that losses loom larger than gains, or this idea that losses are more painful, or the same amount of loss is more painful than that amount of gain is pleasant to experience. But the other thing that's really important to take away from this theory is that this is not a linear function. And the idea is that as you go into a loss, you start really quickly experiencing pain, but then you start to taper off. That as you get deeper and deeper and deeper into loss, once you get to a certain point, you're pretty much at a level place. You're pretty much hit an asymptote where things just go at about the same. And so the amount of pain you experience isn't really changing even as you go into greater and greater loss. And so with investing, we'd consider this break-even point to be your cost basis. Where are you gaining? Where are you losing? And so I think an interesting question for folks who've been holding Bitcoin all the way up from here, from the prior bull market highs, are they already at this plateau? Are they already at, in a sense, maximum pain, where for them, they're not really going to experience any psychological pain above what they're already experiencing? So even if Bitcoin went into a recession and prices fell notably lower, are they really going to feel all that different than they feel right now? They've already experienced a lot of pain. Is that going to really shock them that much and make them feel even more pain? They might be in a position where they're just saying, I bought it, I'm just going to hold it forever. If it gets back to break even or in profit, then I'll sell it. If not, I'll write it off. That could be the mindset a lot of these people have, which means that they might be less likely to add to the sell pressure than maybe you might think. But of course, that might not be the case. It could be that they're still somewhere in this part of the curve where a recession and the fears of those prices could push them down far enough to get them to sell. We'd really have to wait and see. But I think it's one of those things that's interesting to note that we've already gotten to a point where a lot of capitulation has happened. And so in a recession, the question would be then, how much more capitulation could we see, which would likely be that driver of further prices? I think it's reasonable to think that Bitcoin would crash. I mean, I think that's pretty much a consensus view that if we had a recession, all correlations tend to go to one in those early days. Look at the March 2020 crash, and you would see prices fall. But the question of how far it could fall would really depend on some of those psychological factors and if people decide to sell or not. But then importantly, this is all assuming that that recession happens. If the recession doesn't happen, then what we're seeing is that we're in a situation where the people who are in loss are already happy to continue holding it in loss from where they were all the way up here, which means that they're probably waiting for better prices to sell. And we're also seeing that people who bought Bitcoin all the way down here have not been selling, even with these recession fears and all of those things that go along with it. So they're still up here. And so if you take that recession piece out and you say, and suddenly we're in the clear and that's not happening, then we're in a position where's the sell pressure going to come from? Certainly it's going to come from somewhere. There's going to be some selling that happens, but a lot less of it is on the table. And so really what you're waiting for then is wherever that next impulse of demand comes in, and new money entering the space, maybe something like an ETF approval or institutions coming in, and maybe people are more willing to do that if there's recession fears get taken off the table. And then if that sell pressure isn't really there until we hit new all-time highs, you can imagine a world where Bitcoin is able to go on that next bull market relatively easy. And so that's why I think this recession question is really the one that looms the largest, and that's not super surprising, but I think it's for the reasons that we just discussed. Because if you take that out of the picture, then it becomes a lot harder, in my opinion, to argue in any strong case why Bitcoin should just fall off a cliff and go down and test these really low levels. Really, the main argument that bears have to level right now for why that we should expect that is the recession. And if that doesn't happen, then I think it becomes a lot harder to argue that side. Now, none of this is financial advice. You should make your own opinions about where you think things are going to go, how likely you think a recession is to happen, all those types of things. But I think these are useful things to think about to frame that discussion about what we can think of Bitcoin doing, and then why we might think that it might react and different holders might react based on what happens. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates, put indicators and more over there.